Unfortunately, the things that she's dealing with connect very closely, unfortunately. They connect very closely with the things that we're dealing with. So it's just unfortunate that they're on both sides, but at the same time. Okay, so I won't say too much before handing over to the speakers, except to say that what connects all of these papers together is the idea that we can move beyond implication. There's been a lot of discussion in ELF for some time about the pedagogical implications of research and theory and debate. And what each of these papers does, from quite different perspectives and in very different contexts, is look at practical applications about integrating ELF in the curriculum in some way or another. So we have, what we're going to do is speak, each presenter will speak for 20 minutes, and we'll pause at the end of each presentation for a brief question and answer session. So first we have Sonia Moran from the University of Southampton, who is going to talk about engaging with students' metalinguistic discourses. Thank you, Sonia.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be taking part of a colloquium that's posing such a timely but also very delicate question as proposed by Martin. In seeking pedagogical implications and applications, ELF scholars have opened up a variety of lines of inquiry so far, and a lot of questioning has been going on, especially in relation to which linguistic forms we teach and how. But today I would like to talk about more representational or symbolic aspects of English. My own research activities have so far been focused on the world of language perceptions and on how these may be discursively constructed through metalinguistic talk. So for this presentation, I will be exploring the roles that conceptualizations, attitudes, or ideologies play or could play in the English language classroom, and also the pedagogical applications that metalanguage may offer to address them from an ELF-informed perspective. So the first issue that we may want to consider is whether this kind of symbolic aspects are already being addressed or whether they should be addressed in the classroom. And it seems that English has traditionally been introduced to students as a set of autonomous linguistic norms and features, as if it was some sort of objective system which is independent of social and ideological processes. However, even if this approach still seems to be prevalent in mainstream ELT, it no longer seems to coincide with contemporary understandings of what language is or how it actually works. In Kanagaraja's own words, language is meshed with other symbolic systems, and so it's important to give more attention to how attitudinal, psychological, or perceptual factors may operate in language use. And of course, this also applies to language use in lingua franca intercultural interactions. So it is not surprised that it has already been pointed out that we need to move beyond teaching English, or simply teaching English as a set of linguistic forms, in order to also teach about Englishes. That is, to actively engage learners or students into learning about the fixity and variability of the language, but also about the identificational and evaluation processes that are embedded in its use. So, as perhaps Cogo, for example, Matsuda suggests, there's a need to rethink language as a wider process that also addresses users' knowledge or attitudes, as well as other social and political aspects as well. And the relevance of developing this kind of knowledge has already been emphasized in the field in relation to teachers and teacher training. And of course, although this is indeed a crucial first step, perhaps it's also important to start considering the role that English learners can play, or probably play anyway, into the theorization of language, and also to think about how dealing with their or engaging with their awareness may also be necessary to enrich classroom practices. It is already widely acknowledged that lay users, or students as well, already play an active role in processes of conceptualizations, and thus quite complex processes of conceptualization and or ideology management, for example. However, the provision of educational spaces for students to articulate and evaluate their own knowledge still seems to be largely restricted to linguistic programs. Although some students are already finding ways to challenge dominant representations in their local classrooms, as I believe one of the speakers, Lisa, will illustrate later on, there are already calls from researchers for the development of students' awareness to become part of the ELT curricula as well, so that all students have the opportunity to learn about linguistic, social, and other aspects embedded in the lingua franca use in order to be as prepared as possible for their future English needs. As Kubota puts it here, it is both teachers and students that need to have the opportunity to be critically reflective and to engage in constant questioning of multiple ways of thinking about language. Despite the general agreement, there yet seems to be little scholarly discussion on how to actually do this from an education perspective. And given my research background, I decided to explore whether meta-language may be a useful starting point. So now I will explain what I mean by this concept and why I consider it can be a good candidate. So meta-language can be defined as language in the context of linguistic representations and evaluations. For the rest of the presentation, I will be focusing more on the explicit meta-language, so overt references through which people actually define what language is or what it should be or how it works. And although this may perhaps sound rather innocent or even of dubious value for the classroom, we mustn't forget that, as Cameron suggests, these definitions are always an inspection about far more than just language. In fact, meta-language can be better conceptualized as a form of social practice, through which we can, for instance, assign social meanings or values to different ways of speaking, and through which we can also do or perform different kinds of identities. Of course, meta-language, as any other social practice, can also work at an ideological level, at which linguistic representations may be naturalized or modified or challenged. But perhaps more importantly, for the purpose of the colloquium, is that meta-language can also be considered to be an effective educational tool, especially in the field of critical language awareness. And this kind of premise is normally based on an understanding of knowledge as a form of discourse. So, as something that's not neutral or natural, but which needs constant critical reflexivity in order to advance. So the idea would be that by engaging in chronic revision of taken for granted understandings and new ideas as well, students or new information students could be able to develop an awareness or an understanding of their own ideas, other people's ideas, and perhaps even generate new ideas. As Markova and colleagues suggest, when people talk and think together, they not only draw upon social knowledge, but they may also transform it. So I see meta-language as having the potential to bring perspectives in the classroom in similar ways. Perhaps, for example, through group discussions, we may encourage students to engage in critical examination of dominant representations of English, as well as alternative ones, such as the ones proposed from ELF perspectives, in relation to students' own expectations, experiences, and desires. So students could be asked perhaps to identify the different kind of ideological assumptions that underpin each of the potential alternative presentations, and also to think about the social and ideological impact that evaluating language in one or other way may have for speakers across a variety of contexts, from the very own local language classroom of those students to, for example, job interviews or informal everyday interactions. And to see how this may work from a more empirical perspective, I now would like to draw from a focus group study in which university students from Chile, Mexico, and Spain discussed their own views about English, but in which they were also introduced to how some ELF scholars conceptualize its lingua franca use. The study consisted of 6 focus groups, each containing from 4 to 7 undergraduates of a variety of non-language related degrees. And it's important to point out that around half of the participants had already been on exchange abroad programs, so some of them already had some experience of ELF communicative contexts. In order to stimulate their discussions, I gave them this text. So it's in Spanish, you find the English version. It is composed by a series of quotes from different publications, so I just put it together as a collage. And its purpose was to introduce some of the main ideas in the field, from general aspects of the globalization of English to more specific debates surrounding the lingua franca use. And since in the pilot some of the students found the text a little bit abstract, and sometimes they also had difficulty imagining the kind of linguistic variations that scholars were referring to, I also decided to show them extract from an ELF interaction in a business context in which one of the interlocutors produced the omission of the third person s. In terms of analysis, I am particularly interested in looking at the potential of transformation that is attributed to metalinguistic talk. So in my approach, I looked at what constructs, what ideologies, what positions are being drawn upon, with a special interest in seeing which ones are taken as shared or as fixed or stable or as negotiable. And I'm also interested in looking at how people or participants or students in particular also reinforce or modify or challenge social meanings and linguistic representations through dialogue with themselves and with others. And although the analysis of these data is still ongoing, I wanted to share with you how these processes may actually work by looking at one of the extracts from a focus group in Spain, in which 5 university students were discussing the notion of correctness and how to evaluate linguistic differences in lingua franca contexts. So this is the extract, and at this point the students had already read the text, the informative text, and they had looked at the voice extract. And they had also discussed how the omission of the third person s could be interpreted from an ELF perspective or from an EFL perspective. And then I asked them, as we can see here, to share their own thoughts on the matter. So we can see that this omission of the third person s in that particular context was very quickly defined as an error by all of the participants. Perhaps no surprise there. Perhaps to be safe or to show alignment, they all began their evaluation by drawing upon what seemed to be a socially shared or relatively stable assumption, because they, as you can see, they didn't even seem to need to offer any justification for this evaluation for considering it an error. But immediately after, one of the participants else begins a process of negotiation of the nature and applicability of the notion of error. He suggests that it is an error until the norm changes, and then it's no longer considered an error. So with this kind of contribution, he's doing various things. He's invoking and rejecting the notion of error as a static construct. He is also opposing ideas of linguistic features as inherently correct or incorrect, and he is therefore suggesting that what we may consider an error or what we may consider correct or incorrect may be a matter of perception, and that there may be a degree of arbitrariness behind it. So quite a complex conceptualization there. And P here seems to accept this idea of the intrinsic nature of the notion of error, and he reformulates his evaluation of the specific linguistic feature they were looking at as an error for now. Okay?
But in doing so, he is also signaling a belief in that the kind of prescriptions of correctness that are given from language authorities can actually determine the status of a linguistic feature in a sort of top-down and acontextual manner. At this point, Elle, another participant, decides to join the negotiation process. And she suggests that this is an error because they have all thought about it in that way. So what she's doing here, she's reinforcing an earlier definition proposed that error was a matter of perception. P decides to sort of interrupt her. She's saying it is wrong, and he adds because the teacher would mark it down, right? So with this sentence, he is invoking and also identifying English teachers as a source of authority behind the prescription of this norm. But he continues. Interestingly, she says, but if it makes no sense to add the S, if it means the same and you understand equally, why would it not be an innovation? Okay? So what she's doing here, by foregrounding intelligibility over notions of correctness, she is also moving from a sort of macro level or institutional evaluative dimension into a more situational dimension. And in this situational dimension, or situated dimension, we can see that perhaps she considers that those kind of prescriptive norms can actually be questioned or challenged. And so far we can see how while P is working with linguistic representations by which clear-cut boundaries of what's correct or incorrect are necessary, both P and S are collaboratively being able to push those boundaries. In the remainder of the extract, then P tries to engage with this situated dimension. But for him, if the rule for the third person X exists, there must be a reason for it. And he suggests this maybe to facilitate communication, for example. And despite having some issues to back up this argument that he's creating, he later on concludes that otherwise the S would not have included. Okay, so basically, he's here challenging earlier reformulations of norms and errors as arbitrary. But Elle decides here to suggest that the British can be very twisted. So the whole group has a little bit of a laugh about this, but I find this quite interesting because although she is identifying this collective group of speakers as another authority behind the prescription, through the humoristic tone of her comment, she can also be undermining their authority or the legitimacy. P is quite persistent in trying to find a communicative need for the S, and he suggests that because that is necessary to distinguish the subject, but halfway through the sentence he realizes that this is already obvious because of the pronoun. And I find this particularly interesting because this is a moment where he begins to realize that the assumptions he has been drawing upon can also be problematized. In fact, later on in the discussion, he even begins to bring his own examples and his own personal experiences to engage in boundary pushing or boundary challenging in terms of correctness. Although this is a very, very brief extract, I think it illustrates how these kind of dialogic activities may be helpful to address some ELF perspectives in the classroom and also to show how we may encourage students to challenge their own taken for granted assumptions. Although I would not want to suggest that engaging with these activities would be unproblematic. In fact, considering the creation of these spaces for discourse, for reflection, can also bring a lot of challenges and a lot of limitations. In particular, in relation to material design and material selection, we would have to make complex and difficult decisions over what perspectives to include when. And one of the issues I found particularly challenging was trying to anticipate how my materials would be interpreted by the students, because I wanted to make sure that I could help them challenge some of those assumptions, but at the same time I wasn't sure whether they would perhaps even help them reinforce all dichotomies or even create new ones, which is something obviously we would want to avoid. Another particular challenge that I faced was, or that the research consideration would be, with what approach are we going to introduce different linguistic representations if we decide this is what we can do? In my case, I wanted to avoid treating ELF conceptualizations as more or less real or right than the alternatives that students were suggesting or constructing through our discussions. So I was trying to have an open approach by which students would be allowed to think and decide which representations were obsolete or more useful for them and their current needs. But of course, this kind of open approach also runs the risk of getting stuck in some circles of reflection and miss on opportunities for transformative action. So that's the kind of tension that I experienced in the focus groups. And although I have some other tendencies that I can think about, for time reasons I'm going to leave them for another time and move on to the conclusion. Although this has been a very tentative exploration, I think that there are some indications of the benefits that creating spaces for metalinguistic discussion could bring to the classroom. It could be an effective way of engaging with students' knowledge and students' attitudinal orientations, and this is particularly interesting or relevant if we consider that linguistic representations or language reconceptualizations are processes that can also emerge out of the classroom rather than just into it. So it also would be a way of validating students' role in the process. And critical metalanguaging could also be useful to raise awareness over ELF-related aspects for students that have had little experience of it, but also to engage with those that may already be rethinking English in these terms on their own. Finally, although we have seen that some of my students actually experience a little bit of a transformation of their ideas within the locality of our discussions, my data cannot help us understand how this new constructed knowledge may have influenced their linguistic and metalinguistic practices beyond the focus groups. And so this is something, exploring the relationship between how reflexivity, reconceptualizing, and actual language use work and can work. That is something that I have at the top of my research agenda for the future. But perhaps, and it is my hope, that maybe some of my colleagues here today can elaborate a little bit on this, or perhaps shed more light on what I cannot provide. So unless there are any comments or questions, I would be happy to pass the floor to them. And those were my references, and thank
you. So we have about 2 minutes for questions. If anyone has a question or something. Okay, thank you very much. So I'll hand over now to Laura Patsko from St. George International in London, which you will hear is a language school and teacher training centre. And who also has a link to King's College London. And she's going to tell us about talking to novice teachers about it.
Okay. So, hello. Can you hear me? Not too much, not too loud. So my name is Laura. I work at St. George International, which is a language school in London. Some of you know me already. I recognize you. Everybody else, nice to meet you. Most of what I do at the school in London is now teacher training, although I also do some English teaching as well. And most of the teacher training is training in pre-service courses, which is what I'm going to talk about. I became kind of interested in this idea of applications rather than just implications of ELF when I was doing my master's at King's, which is a connection to Kings that Martin mentioned. And I started thinking about what the teachers in our school, and particularly what the teachers who were training, know or think or feel about ELF and applying it to their practice. So to give a little bit of background on the kind of connections as I see it between ELF and the industry as a whole, on the one hand you have this concept that the ELT enterprise really is the most important gatekeeper of English language and what's being taught and what's being learnt in terms of what will be used or is being used. It's all mixed up together, as we all know. But on the other hand, we have teachers who are maybe already in service, but also just sort of fresh from their pre-service training, who don't really have much of a concept of that, the strength of that influence, and maybe don't really fully understand how English is being used around the world, either because their own experience isn't that diverse or because it hasn't been included in their training program. And this was a quotation from one of the teachers in my study last year who had done her training at our school, and a year later still said this. I'd heard the term ELF being used once or twice, but not as often, so I thought, okay, it's not that relevant here. I don't hear people talking about it much. Do I really need to know about this? And I remember thinking, well, yes, I think you do. And I felt a bit bad because I trained this teacher and she still didn't seem to know anything about it. So you have this kind of concept of an industry with a lot of influence into gatekeeping and who uses English and why, and an influence over who will use English and why and whom and so on, but maybe quite low awareness. So just to give a little bit of background to the context that I train in, some of you will be familiar with the SALTA. I think some of you may also be familiar with the Trinity equivalent, the CERT TESOL, and this is the course that we offer at SGI. Just a very quick overview for those who don't know. The course is 4 weeks long, about 90 hours of input, which are sessions, kind of workshop style, on aspects of language analysis and methodology, particularly communicative language teaching. 45 plus hours of extra study, lesson preparation, projects, etc. There is also a strong teaching practice element, observed and assessed. Observations of fellow teachers, both experienced and inexperienced. And coursework projects and language awareness tests. So there's quite a lot of stuff to be fit into this 4-week block. And the way that it's enacted in different centers is based on 2 main documents from Trinity, which are the validation requirements. So what centers need to do in order to offer this course, according to Trinity, and their syllabus. So what content the course provider needs to cover. And in 4 weeks, that means that we've got quite a lot to do, and as a representative timetable, this is what our center's input session, this is mornings only, looks like. It's quite busy. You can imagine no prior experience of teaching covering all of that in 4 weeks. So they have 2 90-minute sessions every morning covering that stuff. By covering, that's quite a loose term, but you talk about it, you do tasks, you analyze it, you watch other people doing it, and so on. And in June last year, Trinity published a new syllabus, and I was interested to see something arise explicitly, which had never been mentioned before, which was ELF. In line with the new syllabus, it meant that our center had to revise our timetable slightly for other reasons too, so we had to restructure some of the teaching practice and so on and so forth. And one of my colleagues was tasked with revising our whole timetable. And as I was the most ELF-informed member of our training staff, she said to me, well, can you create a little session on ELF? So this is what I'm going to show you as examples of the session and how the tutors particularly responded to delivering it. So our question is how to include this in this. And my colleague put it there. You see it? Before? After? Before? There it is. So it's kind of squeezed into the penultimate day of a very busy, very intensive course, and I wasn't allowed to put it earlier in the course, and I asked. So, with that, I had a certain number of considerations. I had to remember all the way through that it's the end of a very intensive course. At this point, the trainees are handing in a lot of work. Most of them have no prior experience of teaching, and they're really very overwhelmed and tired. And I'm coming in all enthusiastic with new concepts of how English is being used around the world. And so I needed to bear in mind who the audience was for this information. I also only had 45 minutes to do it, because I was only given half of an input session, and an input session is 90 minutes. So 45 minutes to introduce ELF is quite a tall order. I also needed to think about what concepts we would talk about. My background is mostly in phonology, and with only 45 minutes, I decided if we were going to talk about specific examples, we would look at pronunciation, because that was what I felt most comfortable with and what I knew most about. So designing the session, I had to be selective somewhere, and that's how I went. I also needed to think about simplifying terminology, both for the trainees' sake, who have already encountered lots of new terms and abbreviations and acronyms and so on in their 4 weeks, but also for the tutors, who haven't all got the same background in ELF that I had. And this relates again to the extent of their knowledge, and later I'll show you the background knowledge that they had before they came to give the sessions. 2 particular examples. All of those points are surmountable. They're fine. I think it's just a question of being selective and flexible, which you have to do in everything that you introduce in a pre-service course, because you're assuming zero knowledge from the beginning of teaching or language or linguistics, except maybe their own sort of apprenticeship of observation, knowing what they know from their own language learning experience. A bigger barrier was actual syllabus ambiguities and contradictions in the content that Trinity sent us itself, but I'll look at that later after I've shown examples of the course. Before I show you, this is my reminder that in 45 minutes to cover all this stuff, as I say, was quite a lot to ask. So what I tried to do was create a number of slides that prompted discussion with some tasks, which are more or less independent, so that tutors could select from them according to what a particular group of trainees seemed most interested in, or at least aware of. But they are to an extent interdependent, so I wouldn't expect to cover all of this in 45 minutes, but depending on the trainees, you can usually do a certain amount. So very quickly, just so I can talk about it rather than just show it to you, we do things like this. So we show them the concentric circles model of English and talk about the geography. And we also acknowledge, as I think it's important, that this is quite an old model, and particularly in discussions of ELF, perhaps what's more relevant is who is speaking to whom and not where they are. But just to give them a background of the kind of questions that have been asked about who is speaking English, so that when we move on to a quick test of statistics, it makes sense, and I get them to try and match speaker populations to speaker groups, like so. To kind of help them reflect a little bit on where they feel they might belong and how people have attempted in the past to categorize or label speakers of English, rightly or wrongly, or judgments aside, just to get them to think a bit more precisely about who is using English and where and so on. We also compare the paradigm they're more familiar with, English as a foreign language, which is still predominantly the perspective taken on the course, with English as a lingua franca, and we use this, I found this a very helpful contrast. This comes from Robin Walker's book on teaching the pronunciation of English as a lingua franca. And so we go through some various sort of perspectives, typical perspectives, and again, it's an overview, it has been simplified, but just to give them this concept of approaching their teaching and the learning of English with a kind of ELF filter, looking at things from a different perspective. And I try and elicit as much of this from them as I can, based on what they already know, or what they think, or how they themselves use English. If time, but we don't usually have time, we look at the lingua franca core. Again, because of my background is mostly in phonology, and so I felt that I could say more about this than, say, features of discourse or communication strategies, and I get them to guess which of these features they think research has shown to be crucial for international intelligibility, and they never get the core, which is this. And they're usually quite surprised, and it raises some discussion, and so on and so forth. This is where we spend most of the time, if possible, trying to actually talk about the issues, the debate, some of the key questions. And depending on who gives the course, we may touch on these areas throughout the course anyway, but tutors have different styles and different knowledge and different backgrounds, and they won't all have covered some of these issues until this point in the course, which is maybe a little bit late, but that's the point for discussion when we revise the course. And I leave them with some reading materials which we have in our school, so if they want to have a look, they can look at it then, rather than just give them a list to take away and lose, which is what they do with most of the things we give. So, that's a kind of very quick whirlwind tour of what we show the trainees, but there was also an element of needing to support the tutors in doing this. So we created some input notes to suggest to the tutors which points of those slides might be skipped or detailed or might be quite important to cover, and also some possible objections or questions to anticipate so that they could respond appropriately. So there were little tips like, here's a book in the staff room where these definitions come from. Kind of just pointers, because teachers are very busy people, teacher trainers are very busy, kind of just helping them know where the information's come from, so that they don't think I'm just being an ELF evangelist, where that term came from this morning. Making sure what to cover in feedback. Variation is a natural part of language. They should be aware that the discussion they're having is about how language varies and is used variably. It's not about one way of teaching replacing another, or being better or worse, and so on. And slides they could skip if they're short of time, as they're not considered crucial. Now, the feedback has been a bit mixed. There's only 5 tutors in our school who deliver input sessions. I'm one of them, and of the other 4, only 2 have given this session, as what often happens when they get to this point in the course is if I'm not training on the course, they cover my lesson and I come and do this session. So in terms of getting feedback from the tutors, I've got 2 for you. One of them was quite pro the whole idea, and her background knowledge came from the Cutting Edge course book and this interview with Jenny Jenkins, which appeared about 7 years ago. So this was what she knew about ELF before she came to this course. And in-house workshops, by which she means the workshops that we deliver in our school on ELF, which were all delivered by me. So a lot of my colleagues, thank you, have got their background knowledge from my own background knowledge. A lot of it's transmitted through me, so there's going to be evident biases. She's in favor of including ELF in pre-service courses. She said the trainees responded very positively. She also thinks it's important to incorporate ELF naturally throughout the course and not just at the end. My other colleague was a little bit less prepared to deliver the sessions, didn't feel as comfortable doing it. So his knowledge of ELF was based solely on what he'd heard in workshops that I'd given. He didn't know anything else before working at our school or in any of his own training. He was against including ELF because he felt the syllabus was generally too crowded anyway, and in his words, ELF is not a priority. He just felt that it was a kind of concept, something interesting, but a bit too big for trainees to get their heads around, and didn't think it was important. And he doesn't include this session in the timetable, even though it's in our timetable. He just does that stuff. So that brings us to the issues of the syllabus, because creating the session itself is not necessarily that problematic, but implementing it throughout the course is a little bit more problematic, as Trinity's own view of what ELF is and how it could be included or conceptualized is not that clear. So where I showed you earlier that they include ELF in the new syllabus, they also group it with geographical varieties. So they're using variation and varieties more or less interchangeably and not defining that anywhere. They're also in the syllabus in the course projects identifying trainees' ability to analyze their students' needs and abilities in very conflicting ways. So you have use of contrastive analysis for diagnosis and correction of errors with no definition of those terms or any statement anywhere about what sort of standard or reference they should be using. They seem to think that decoding natural native speech is the main goal of the learners that these trainees will be teaching. That may not be the case, but they just slip that into the syllabus like that. And in productive skills, they talk about producing particular features, using them accurately, using them correctly, but again, without defining these terms or the scope of these terms or giving any suggestions. It's kind of left up to discretion, but it's evident throughout the book what their assumption of the learner's needs will be. And the course requirements themselves make a lot of references to what is acceptable from the teacher in the course if they are training to be role models as language teachers. Again, it's not described, it's just sort of left to the center's discretion to identify what kind of trainee would make a good role model as a language teacher. It also refers to trainees' language being intelligible to a wide variety of linguistic groups, but no definition of intelligible or who they might be teaching or speaking to, who their learners might be speaking with. And they can actually be failed on the course if the representative from Trinity who visits at the end determines that their standard of English is significantly below that required. So, all told, I think there's a positive aspect of this, and that ELF has appeared in the syllabus. There's a recognition of variation and or variety. It's not entirely clear if Trinity have defined what that is or how they expect centers to make that work in practice. But there's a recognition of there being greater sociolinguistic awareness on the part of trainees. It's still quite innovative to include it in pre-service training, from what I know. It's perceived by some, including tutors themselves, as a bit too esoteric, just too out there for trainees to handle in their pre-service training. The syllabus itself I've talked about. I will say that the input session we've done has been generally well received by trainees, but the tutors themselves, I think, need to have greater knowledge and greater comfort in delivering the session and in raising the issues throughout the course, rather than just as a brief discussion at the very end, when it's quite late in the day, everybody's tired, and it's a bit hard to squeeze that into the course. But on the whole, I think the outlook is good. It's just going to take a bit more work to make more people comfortable with this. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laura. We have, again, 1 or 2 minutes if you'd like to ask Laura a question. Okay. Laura. Thank you. So I'm now going to hand over to Immaculada Pineda, who's going to talk to us about a practical case study. Immaculada is from the University of Moran.
Good afternoon. I would like to first of all thank Dewey for inviting me to be part of this colloquium. And I would like to introduce you to this metaphorical path. In 2007, the Spanish government issued a royal decree establishing the structure and prerequisites for all graduate studies in Spain, both the new master's degrees and the doctoral programs. Little did I know then how much this piece of legislation would change my teaching, my research focus, and basically my career path, hence the visual method. At the time, I was a part-time instructor at the University of Malaga. I was also involved in several in-house training courses, teaching English at some private companies and public institutions, and I was conducting research on contemporary African-American literature. When the first department meetings took place to design the new curriculum for the master's degree in English Studies and Multilingual and Intercultural Communication, a colleague and I felt the need to insist on including a course on ELF. Because of my experience in the private sector, I was informed of the growing demand for courses in English as a lingua franca, particularly English for specific purposes in the south of Spain, focusing in the fields of engineering, ICT, architecture, and biology. What my students from Fujitsu, for example, were demanding is that they were taught English to be able to communicate with their clients, the majority of whom were non-native English speakers. And this is how our course English as a lingua franca for science and technology was created. A colleague and I, Dr. Maria del Mar Verdejo, first conducted an informal needs analysis to identify the specific language skills to be developed through the syllabus. We decided to divide the course into 2 sections: Oral Communication Acts in ELF for Science and Technology, and ELF and a Scientific Research Article. As part of the first section of this course, we agreed on having an assignment that would be a project-based learning activity, PBL, from now on. This activity was called Delivering a Paper at a Conference. First, students are presented with information about conference lectures, their macrostructure, their microstructure, and the linguistic features of lectures as compiled by several scholars, Sonia, Pineda, Ventola, and Reinhardt. Then students are familiarized with concepts of English as a lingua franca and lingua franca core, and some linguistic features that are acceptable variations from the norm in lingua franca settings. And finally, students would have to select a published journal article on science and technology and deliver it at a MAR conference. The main purposes of this PBL activity are to make our students understand the idiosyncratic nature of conference lectures, because they are at the interface between scientific prose and spontaneous conversation. And also, our students need to realize that spoken scientific discourse at conferences varies linguistically, paralinguistically, and metalinguistically from scientific articles and also from other types of oral communication acts. Then also following PBL's premise of learning by doing, our intention is that our students learn how to deliver a paper at a conference, not only to participate themselves in international academic events in the future, but also so that their prospective students of ELF can present lectures in English. We also intend to make our students aware of the demand in the labor market in Spain for teachers of ESP by students who will be using ELF rather than EFL. With unemployment rates over 50% of the active population under 25 the age of our students, the University of Malaga is highly involved in developing employability skills in our graduates. And now let's move on within this transformative journey to the second part of this presentation, background and context. Since 2008, in our course we have had a total of 125 students. 100 of them took the activity. A prerequisite to enroll in our master's degree is to have a C1 level of English according to the CEFR. However, not all of our students fulfill this requirement, and many of them have a B2 level. The majority of our students are Spanish, 66%, but many are from other nationalities, 17 total, providing the group with a true multicultural background. Out of these 107 students, 2 of them were native English speakers, 1 British, 1 American, 72 had Spanish as their L1, and there were 14 other first language backgrounds. You have the information about our students here. Our research is based on years of study, and it was partly collected in field observation notes and in recordings. As you could notice from the introduction, all recorded speech events were monologic, and they all took place in 2 conference lecture halls. We have a little picture, some pictures of the actual sessions, so that the paralinguistic and the non-linguistic features of their presentations that were also being assessed would be as close to the intended context as possible. In our class sessions and prior to their assessment, students were provided with a rubric adapted from Susan Reinhardt's Giving Academic Presentations. That's the handout I just gave out. Given that Reinhardt's table was originally designed for native English speakers, adaptation was considered necessary so that the rubric would also include ELF variants and comments on potential communication problems. Students were advised to use this rubric while preparing their lectures and to voluntarily assess 2 or 3 other classmates during their presentations. This rubric is a useful tool that provides the basis for reflection, self-evaluation, and peer review. It is aimed at integrating several assessment methods at the same time to encourage self-learning through self-assessment, collaborative learning through peer review, and traditional learning through the professor's feedback, fostering understanding and indicating a way to proceed with further learning and teaching. So originally we started noting down and recording our students' performances only for assessment purposes. But we soon realized the possibilities for research that this activity had and how we could revert this research to our students by integrating its results back into our teaching. I have to confess that in 2008, when I started this course, I was only familiar with some of the findings in ELF research, particularly those focusing on lingua franca core, but I was unacquainted with the ELF project developed in Finland and with the findings that have been published by several other scholars. So therefore relying on our own research made sense. Let's move on to results. I wanted to record what Bjorkman calls morphosyntactic non-native-like use and make our students aware that their common ELF variations would normally not result in communication breakdown. Following what Bjorkman proposes, I divided variations from the standard into 3 categories: variations that prevent communication, variations that are successful, and devices that improve understanding. The process was as follows. First, all of the ELF variations were identified, recorded, and classified. Then, and again following Björman's methodology, I focused only on features that were used by different speakers with a minimum of 10 times. Because instances of miscommunication had to be identified, we had 3 different criteria. The first one would be that after the lecture, the speaker would be asked questions that would clearly mark that there was some kind of communication problem, maybe requesting a repetition of the term, for example. Then also we used the rubrics that we circulated in class to identify specific communication problems that were discussed by several students on the same presentation. In the cases when no questions were asked and no rubrics were submitted, if both professors agreed that a specific variation prevented communication, that was also recorded, but this was the least productive of our criteria. Let's move along and discuss now variations that prevent communication. We have the alternation between third-person singular pronouns or possessive adjectives, using he, she, or it indistinctively to refer to the same subject, or his and her to refer to possessive adjective. You have the examples here. His, her instead of his, or he instead of it in the second example. Either of these variants created misunderstandings since the listeners were uncertain if the antecedent for the pronoun or the possessive adjective was a man, a woman, or an object. This phenomenon has been previously recorded by several scholars, EFL scholars, indicating that these gender agreement errors are common for speakers whose L1 is either Spanish, Basque, Catalan, or French. So, drawing from the pragmatics of variation that Professor Wilson presented this morning, I would say in this case that L1 here is probably influencing the use that they're doing of this pronouns and adjectives. Also, more variations that prevent communication or alter communication is the pronunciation of key terms. We have several examples here. I would like to particularly focus on the second one, where we have ships instead of sheets, halt instead of health, and engine instead of engine. In the second one, we received feedback from one of the rubrics saying, I could not understand what she was saying until I saw it on screen. After that, it was okay. Most of the examples have to do with the students' disregard of the lingua franca core principles discussed in class. Every example in these 2 categories affected the final assessment of the student negatively. And now moving on with our path, we have variations that were successful. First, I have plurals. Under this category, I included not only the pluralization of uncountable nouns, but also the pluralization of adjectives. Let me get a bit closer for you. In this case, there was no communication disturbance, so basically we understand that there was L1 influence in this case. Then we have a sporadic 0 marking for the third-person singular of the present of verbs. And like what Dewey and Cogo found in their corpora in 52% of unmarked cases. My results are more in line with Brighton and others, where she found 80% of forms morphologically marked for a third-person singular in the present tense. This means that the percentage of unmarked forms in our corpus is relatively low, only 18%. In my opinion, there are 2 reasons for this discrepancy with other analysis. On the one hand, my corpus was made up of only monologic speech acts. And on the other hand, the level of formality in these speech events was very high. Wilson aptly argues that a communicatively redundant feature, such as the third-person singular as marking, can convey a message on a different level.
He considers that grammar can be used to establish the speaker's belonging to a specific group, precisely because grammar is so often redundant in communicative transactions. It takes on another significance, namely that of expressing social identity. I also agree with several other ELF scholars in that the third person S assumes importance as one of the markers of in-group membership, Seidel-Hofer and Pineda, or in marginal ELF setting, as Cogo and Dewey argue, where S marking might be part of the convergence process of EFL speakers towards native English speaker as speech patterns. In our case, however, out of the total of 9 sessions we had for the PBL activity, there was only one native speaker present in 2 sessions, one British, one American, as I mentioned. Thus, the lower occurrence of 0 marking in our compilation would rather be explained by the technicality and the high level of formality of these monologic speech acts, rather than a possible accommodation process towards ENL patterns. It could be argued that since conference lectures have a combination of linguistic features typical of both scientific prose and formal conversation, the higher adherence to S marking in our corpus could also be explained by the context, rather than the presence or absence of native English speakers. Then we have the regularization of irregular verbs. There were relatively few cases of this feature. Thank you. Only 15 instances in the 107 presentations. However, because this feature coincides, I'm sorry, it's probably too far, coincides with the same phenomenon in some varieties of English, I thought it was also worth mentioning. Basically, the regularization of irregular forms, even if rarely encountered, is easily comprehensible by ELF speakers. Moving on to the next feature, prepositions, I have to say that this was by far the feature that was most widely used by our subjects. Our results still need to be categorized and systematized, but I still will provide some examples here for the purpose of giving our research circulation. We have a simplification of the time and place trio in, at, on, towards, just in, something which goes in line with Moran's findings from the ELF corpus. Innovative preposition use or insertion of redundant prepositions. This is also parallel to what Björkman has described about Swedish engineering students and Cogo and Dewey recorded in the book. If you want, I have examples for that. We also have subject-verb disagreement, particularly the use of singular verb forms for collective pronouns, people is, people doesn't understand, and the use of plural forms for pronouns, for example, everybody, are. Again, this feature has been previously discussed by ELF researchers. Then we have the analytic comparative. We had a total of 25 cases of analytic comparative, and again, they did not cause any kind of problem in understanding. Let's move on now to the devices that improve understanding. This is the last section of my results. Devices were identified as reformulation, visual aid, and supportive listening. Reformulation was reported despite no sign of communication disturbance. The speaker would just reformulate, rephrase, or repair their language just as they went along in their lecture. When informally asked about this, speakers expressed their concern about making themselves understood, given that they were discussing technical information maybe about molecular fusion or something, but to an audience that they knew would not be familiar with those terms because they knew that they were English studies students. We also have visual aid, as I mentioned, for the pronunciation problem. Once you saw the word on screen or some image, you could understand and you could follow the message. And also supportive listening. This is one of the several strategies that come from ELF accommodation, as described by Seidel-Hofer and Jenkins, several other scholars too. And in this case, we noticed that our students demonstrated that they would actively engage in the understanding of the message and also provide very positive, generous feedback on the rubrics. Here you have a summary of our findings, but because we're almost running out of time, let me move on to the conclusions, the final destination of this journey. So how do all these findings affect our teachings? We found very positive aspects. ELF can help our students' confidence and our students' in fluency. We have found that PBL activities, when integrated in a broader teaching methodology, in this case ELT, with a focus on ESP and with an ELF approach, these PBL activities can derive quite positive results. We have the highest scores in students' opinion surveys, highest in the master's degree and highest in the department, several years in a row. We also have relatively high academic standard, 8 out of 10, so it's actually quite high. Over time, I have adapted my teaching to include more examples and more items that can be considered ELF variants. I have also adapted my assessment strategies, focusing more on the actual delivery of the message and the non-linguistic and paralinguistic devices used to achieve this PBL activity purposes, as opposed to a more formal assessment that concentrated on grammar deficiencies to move towards an intercultural acceptance of difference. Still, these changes were only possible in the oral section of the course. All written assignments had to follow an EFL approach, and therefore certain variations that were perfectly normal in the oral sessions were inadmissible for the essays and written assignments, and therefore those would affect the students' final result negatively. Well, I would like to finish with just a little wish. I have the hope that there are more ELF courses in Spanish universities in the master's degree level, because ours is the only one so far, and we could establish a network of both ELF researchers and ELF teachers to combine our resources and to move from implication to application. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Immaculada. Are there any questions? We have 1 or 2 minutes. We're not doing very well on questions today. Maybe it's the time of day.
The 1 or 2 minutes, sort of. Makes people feel.
I'm putting too much time pressure on the questions. I'm sorry. Is it going to take 1 or 2 minutes? Sorry, Suzanne.
Just clarifying very briefly, so the course was devised for English language specialists, or what kind you said, like master's
It's part of
degree?
the master's degree in English studies.
And that comprises linguistics and literature?
Yes, and history.
And those students are aiming to have a career in what kind of field?
Any kind of field. Most of our students in the future, what they do is they end up teaching English language. Some of them join our department, and then they teach in linguistics.
I was wondering, was there any interest from your literary colleagues in this?
From my
literary colleagues. I mean, there was MA students in language and literature.
Yes.
So they're studying literature at the same time as they're studying language.
Yes.
And there are all kinds of non-conformities in literary writing. For example, and literature in English apart from anything else, but there are also poetic deviations as well. And I was wondering whether that might be one way of getting them into an awareness, because in literary writing one sees these deviations, so to speak, as entirely appropriate for the purpose of that particular kind of communication.
My literature colleagues have not expressed any interest in our course, but we have had received some criticism from my language colleagues saying, so you're teaching EFL rather than, what is this ELF thing that you're doing?
I mean, they are themselves concerned with teaching a deviant form of English. They are teaching linguistic poetry. how do they explain the non-conformities of poetry which they don't accept in other forms of... I'm simply suggesting that this may be one point of connect, because the language literature thing is very common, and there's always this tension between the two. And the literature people always feel that if you are talking about anything which is not standard English, you are undermining the language.
Yeah.
Although they're dealing with people who've already undermined the language by writing poetry.
Yes.
So my question, really, there is, I think, very interesting the work you're doing, but it may be a way of actually making your colleagues aware, let alone...
See, I wish I could make myself aware of this, because as I mentioned, I previously worked on contemporary African American literature.
Exactly.
And now I'm working on ELF, and I don't seem to find a clear connection where I can find, I can direct them both.
That is a connection.
Yeah.
I mean, if you've got world English, why can't you have world English? If you've got non-conformities in the exploitation of the resources of a language for literary effect, why would you deny it when you're doing exactly the same for a non-literary effect? And the whole issue is what is appropriate to the kind of discourse you're pursuing. So it seems interesting that you should move from your previous interest to the one you got now. It seems to be entirely consistent.
Yeah. We discussed about this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, and now we're going to move to Melissa Yu, who's going to talk to us about, I can't read, reconstructing teaching theory in relation to adopting a critical perspective. And Melissa is from the University of Southampton.
Teachers, they reconstruct the concept of, or reconceptualize the concept of an ELF and then integrate that into their teaching practices. And this is part of my PhD research project. So first of all, I would like to give you a sort of like a little research background of my research project. That is one of the main aim of my PhD project is to explore the connection between the theories of teaching and practices. And my assumption here is that my PhD research project is based on the assumption that I have sort of like the concepts of an ELF has been like integrated into a part of a teaching repertoire, if I can use this term. So it's part of a teaching theory. Yes, so that's how how the ELF concepts inform my research. Now I'll give you an outline of today's presentation. Is that I'm going to, as I said, I'm going to explore the connection between like the practical theories and the practices of teaching. So I will give a very brief reviews on teacher education, classroom practices, second language classroom research, and then I will move on to how I take ELF approach to make sense of these practices, and then after that I will use my sort of like draw on the findings of my classroom observation data, and then to integrate that how we can take ELF approach to integrate that into teacher education courses and then teaching practices inside the classroom. So basically I reviewed some literatures on teacher education, and then one of the really informative review is done by Cogo, forgive my pronunciation, Cogo, hopefully I didn't pronounce it, to not so appropriate. Yeah, and he reviewed the literature reviews on the studies on teacher education and concludes that there is actually a very imbalanced sort of like a teacher training input in terms of theories and practices, especially they give like student teachers more theoretical support less practical support. And then in terms of the content of teaching, the contents of the teacher training is more like even the teacher training courses, they have offered like theories or practices, like sort of like resources. However, the teacher trainer has some limitations in doing help the student teachers here. I mean, student teachers to reconceptualize these established theories or practices examples, or help them to negotiate the possible pedagogical alternatives or transformative changes in their own context. So he also highlights that the teacher education, they have a little training how to integrate the theories into practices. So as a whole system, teacher training system, is more like not so balanced between theories and practices. So the previous ELF conferences, a lot of people saying how to move from the implications toward application. I think this is not only a problem or issue to consider for ELF researchers. I think most researchers in applied linguistics have this kind of concern. And today I'm going to try to address this, explore the connection between these two. So I propose that we should look at the dialectical relation between the theories and practices. And Johnson, she mentioned that research into the second language classroom research tends to reproduce. Their research tends to reproduce the theories and practices dichotomy. So basically, research becomes a theory, but they only generate implications without practical theories for them to apply into their classroom. So they attend to what theories say should happen in the classroom, and rather to look at theory and practices together to in turn to inform the theory or inform the research. So in this way, they propose that this is a two-way relationship between them. And because the limitation of time, so I can't really give you more information about this, but if you want to explore more about theories and practices, you can refer to this book. And the first chapter is by Henry Whittleston, and very informative, I have to say. And then, so they propose a lot of good ideas how to narrowing gap, or perhaps bridging up the communication between theories and practices. So it's not only to look at how teachers translate the theories into practice, but also how they produce or reconceptualize the theories through reflecting on their teaching circumstances, their teaching context, or their teaching practices. So my research is mainly to look at what is actually taught inside the classroom, how they reconceptualize and link back to ELF. So that's why it makes it important to look at the teaching practices inside the classroom. And they also brings up the same idea. They say teachers' professional knowledge, including ELF, they becomes embedded in teaching action. So it's important for us to look at what is actually taught. And then also, ELF research gives the teachers a chance to sort of articulate what kind of theories actually support their practices, whether it is ELF relevant or irrelevant. And Johnson, so that's why I'm sort of agree with Johnson's proposal looking at classroom-based research, is that not only look at the practices, but also interview teachers what kind of theory supports you to do that, yeah, and then sort of inform each other. But there are many aspects of teaching practices which aspect is most, because I can't really name all of them today, so I just give you one example that is most informative to my PhD research. It's about like a teacher's refractive practices, and then I use these practices and to look at how teachers, they reflect on their classroom practices and then their theoretical construct, including their practices, how they enrich the meaning, pedagogical meanings of my ELF research. And these are some examples, and referring back to what Sonia says about, mentioned about like a student's like input, it plays a part in the research actually. So one of my teacher participants, Lindsay, she has a student, her student's Pablo actually has a really good linguistic diversity awareness, if I can put it like this. He mentioned that, teacher, how come I can understand your English, but when I step outside of the classroom, I cannot understand other people's English. So she started to reflect on her own teaching practices, why my students cannot understand other people's English. And he started to reflect and re-theorize the concepts and then put it into practices. And that's how she sees the alternatives and how her teaching is a bit like moving toward more ELF-oriented. Before I give you more examples of my data, I would like to introduce two concepts which I applied and sort of incorporating into my the teacher training courses that I taught in the last semester. And then also I used this kind of a strategy to interview my teacher participants when I was collecting data. One is reflection in action. That is sort of, this kind of concept is proposed by Sean, and hope pronunciation is correct. Yeah. He proposed that the reflection in action is actually a reflective actions occurs during teaching, and then to mainly look at how teachers they adjust or maybe readjust their teaching practices in response to their teaching circumstances or context, or when they encounter a problem in the classroom, how they identify the problem, how they refer to their teaching repertoire, and or draw on different examples to reframe their teaching or to sort out the problem. And then the other reflective action is reflections on action that occurs before or after. So I use this mainly for teacher education to sort of help my master students to integrate the concept of ELF into teaching practices. So that helps them prepare or plan or think about the teaching practice in the future, how they can link that to ELF. And also I introduce some of my examples, give them some of the examples that I draw on from my research to help them to consider what has actually happened in the classroom. So this is, now I'm going to visualize the classroom settings and classroom practices, and then in relation that to individual teachers development, professional development, also teacher education. That is, first I exemplified, give examples for or against ELF teaching practices, and then to students, and then relate that to, incorporate that into the teacher education courses. And then I let my students to practice observing these practices or read the classroom abstracts and ask them to reflect on it, to develop their own intellects in sort of seeking pedagogical alternatives or integrated theories into practices. So these are the activities I use. Two important concepts: reflection in action, reflection on action. So I'm now going to give you sort of two examples that I identified in my classroom observation data through looking at their teaching practices. And one example is for more ELF-oriented. The other one is more like a sort of deviation from the ELF practices. And then I demonstrate these discourses. At the same time, I play it with the audio recording. And then they start like reflecting on these teachers' practices. And then they identify some certain patterns, saying like, why through like Victor's teaching, he reproduced the American English input through using the American TV programs and Friends, and then this has been reproduced. And the students, as you can see from the response, R stands for response initiated by the students, they passively receive the input. So they didn't really raise the like a challenge or something. And this classroom, this kind of teaching has been like each class they have reproduced this kind of input twice, and this kind of training has been reproduced like two semesters. Yeah, and then there isn't any change in that classroom. And then as you can see, I play the video thing so they can, observe the classroom practices. And the same, this is so-called like Victor's like theoretical construct. This teacher said why I still wanted to insist on American English input or American culture input is because he actually has the awareness of the linguistic culture diversity. And he didn't seek to change it because the Taiwanese education, ELT education system is under US-based system. That's his reasons for his practices. And then another example is more ELF-oriented. That she used this teacher Grace. She used US-based teaching material, but she made comments critically on the content and say, we don't go to America to live. So that's the American immigrants' business, not our business. And then she started initiate some pedagogical changes, and that's because because of time. So I will present tomorrow if you go to the next colloquium. And this is a theoretical construct by the teacher saying why students should explore their own topics in their own time rather than based on the NS-based teaching materials and then learn. And then she emphasized, I don't consider geographical perspective to conceptualize English. So that's how she theorized her practices. And these are some questions that I use for teacher training in the two different courses and to help my students, master students, to think about whether there is a problem in the textbook in terms of a cultural linguistic representation, and how, if you encounter similar question, would you initiate any changes to reframe your teaching practices? And then also some other questions. This is just I give you some examples of questions that I help my students to reconceptualize the teaching practices from ELF perspective. So I use, we still have time? Okay, so this basically is the activity, reflection activities that I use for teacher training, but this is based on my PhD research project. And that's why I look at document how teachers, they reflect on during their teaching, they reflect on their own practices and then start seeking ELF approach to change the content of the teaching and also how they do it, the techniques. And this code can be also informative for a teacher trainer, and then how they integrate, as I mentioned, integrate the theories into practices, how they train their pre-service teachers. And this is use the reflections and how to inform the ELF research to look at more classroom practices rather than we can see the other way, by looking at the classroom practices, how we conceptualize ELF and to fit local context. So the conclusion is that, as I said, some of more ELF-oriented practices that is emerged from the practices. So it will be interesting to look at the practices and then to see whether there are more examples that can further reconceptualize ELF. And this is today's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melissa. We have about 30 seconds for this. Or I suggest you ask Melissa questions tomorrow. Thank you very much. I'm going to now hand over to Alessia Cogo, who is from Goldsmiths, University of London, recently. From Goldsmiths, University of London. Is that news? That's news, okay. It's nice to bring news as well.
The other computer before realizing that it didn't work anymore. Thank you very much. Yes, so just recently moved to Goldsmiths, University of London, so this is my first appearance in a new institution mode. And this is moving by itself, so I don't know why. But my talk today is actually a little bit different from what I usually talk about, because from a sociolinguistic, more pragmatics of ELF, I move a little bit in my last part of my project to material development. So the title for today's talk is Material Development for Business Professionals Between Experts and Textbooks. And I've moved towards material development, which for me is a new area, and I've had to read quite a lot about it. Because my participants started talking quite a lot about, or mentioning textbooks when I interviewed them and when we carried out focus groups. And they were mentioning examples of their training, their business training, and mentioning the textbooks that their teachers were using. Hence my interest in developing the last part of the research and applying this to reflections on textbooks. So this is part of a 3-year project. I'm sorry that this moves like that. A 3-year project on multilingual practices and ELF in business communication. I've already presented this at various conferences and published about it, so I'm not going into the details of the project itself, which was more of a sociolinguistic project. But what I want to say is that among the companies that I worked with in the project, there was a multinational company based in France, and I focused and worked with participants in different branches. And these are the same participants that I worked with to develop the last phase of the project, which is more looking at the applications of all the material that I collected and the discussions with the participants for language training and material development. So the aim of today's talk is more to give you an example, and compared to the other talks, I think this is more of a micro example of how to develop an ELF-oriented approach into existing classroom practice, focusing specifically on material development within a multilingual perspective, which is what came out quite strongly from my research. And I adopt an ethnographic methodology, which involves making the learners and experts, business experts, part of developing the, looking at the material. And this is for me quite important because when I reviewed the literature on material development, I realized that this is a huge area of research, that I had a lot to read up. And, but so far, what I realized is that it's concentrated mainly on teachers' views. And the latest publication in the area acknowledged this. So starting from Gray, who published a seminal book on the global textbook and the consumption and production of global textbooks, Gray views students as chief consumers of textbooks, but usually they are not involved in either selecting or evaluating the textbook that they're using in the classroom. And he sees this as a problem. Ian McGrath's latest publication, also quite an interesting, informative book, comprehensive work actually. It focuses mainly on teachers' roles in developing materials, but he actually dedicates a full chapter to the students' views, but he recognizes that the studies on students' views and involving students in material development are very few, and they usually report students' views through the teachers. So it's the teachers saying what the students think about the textbook and not the students themselves. So in these studies I try to redress the balance, and I try to address the students' perspective. And the focus is considering ELT material for business ELT materials. Yeah. But the students or learners that I dealt with are actually not really, or a bit of strange, not strange, but they're actually, the people, the participants in these companies are actually they consider themselves as learners, but at the same time they're experts in their own fields. So they've got this kind of flowing from one moment where they see themselves as learners and one moment where they see themselves as experts. I involve them as experts in their profession, considering asking them to use their expertise to reflect on how useful certain materials will be in their profession. And also I consider people mainly that I tried to create a sort of criteria in my selection of the participants. There would be people who had a certain experience, usually about 20 years of experience, of a certain age within the company, etc. So not the new arrivals, but people who had already been there for a while. And just a quick excursus on textbooks. Textbooks are really quite key aspects of teachers' professional lives. They are considered to take up 90% of classroom times, and what the majority of teachers teach and how they teach is said to be determined today by textbooks. And we are usually, when these people talk about textbooks, they refer to the global textbook, and this is what I am considering actually today. In Gray's book, the course book is seen, textbook or course book is seen as a very problematic artifact, not only because it is a curriculum artifact, but it's also a cultural artifact, so that it portrays a certain idea, construction of what culture is, etc. So at this point, I thought, okay, I need to engage my participants with textbooks. What do? I need to look at the textbooks that are available, the global textbooks in business. Now, for anybody that deals with business training, I think you know that you will be spoiled for choice. There's so many textbooks out there, and it will be very, very difficult to actually go through all of them. So I actually found a shortcut, which I'm not entirely happy with, but it is a way of addressing the issue of having to deal with so much material. I had to select some to give to the participants. So I looked at the ELTJ, the English Language Teaching Journal, survey of reviews of textbooks. So the English Language Teaching Journal publishes regularly every year at least one survey of textbooks. Basically, the reviewer collects as many textbooks as possible within one field and reviews them according to a certain determined list of criteria. And this is being done for textbooks of business English as well. The most recent survey review was published by Reed in 2011, and it's quite a comprehensive review of the textbooks available up to until that time. Now, when I looked at this review, I was quite puzzled because the review doesn't mention anything about going beyond the native speaker ideal in language textbooks. It was quite a native speaker-oriented review, and it's available, you can read it. But at the beginning of the review, it says publications in business English addressed to an international audience today embrace non-native speakers as equals. this sentence is not clarified, it's left like that at the beginning of the review, and then nothing else is said in the rest of the review. So I still don't know what it means, embracing native speakers, non-native speakers as equals in business publications. However, I looked at the review, and what I noticed apart from this is the fact that nothing is said about multilingual practices in business context. No mention at all. It's not a surprise, I was expecting this, but it's quite difficult to face it when you look at all these publications. Okay, so in this project I draw in learners and users' knowledge to help reflect on the material that are meaningful to them. In a way, I refer to the idea of learners as ethnographers that was introduced in 2000 by Roberts and others, that looked at learners reflecting as participants in their own life, understanding and selecting the things that were important to them. But in this case, I look at experts as ethnographers, so the experts themselves select what is important to them and reflect on this, comparing to the textbook. So it's a more of an ethnographic approach to material development. What I did was basically run a few things with the learners, experts. One was asking them to compile a log of activities in 1 week. So 1 week in the life of the professional. So they had to basically take notes every, say, I said half an hour, 1 hour, but then it depended on them and how busy they were, on what they were doing. So basically on a log sheet they had to say, okay, I've written an email in Italian about this, I have had a meeting with this, etc., etc. And the language they were using, etc. And I also asked them to produce photos of their learning of their work environment. Also photos that I took because I was there as well. But the screenshots they produced of their own computer, what they were working on, that was for them sounded interesting. Other visuals, text, reports, emails, policies that they could volunteer. And I interviewed them various times. And for this last phase, I ran a focus group with them and observations. So let's have a look at the contributions that they volunteered. So in terms of 1 week in the life of the participants, they volunteered, this is one of the examples that they gave me, but the participants basically, for instance, they put down something like they watched the live conference with the then EU President Mario Draghi, Italian, but who was speaking in English, and followed by the discussion in the office, had a discussion about the conference in Italian. As I said, the branch is based in Italy. One of the participants had to take notes and then write a report in English, and then regularly they have meetings in English or French about these events, and then have to write up minutes in English. So this is an example of the multilingual practices that they carried out in their company, with constant interplay of languages in their work practices, and also interplay of languages in all business practices, from face-to-face meetings, conference calls, emails, informal conversation, also along the continuum of spoken and written modes. There's always a change. It's not that everything is written in English and everything is spoken is in Italian. There's a mixture of all sorts of things. And a lot of translanguaging is going on. I won't dwell too much on this because I've talked about this before. But they volunteered also examples of policy documents and screenshots of internal presentations, and what I highlighted here, the red part is the French presentations, the green part is the Italian presentation, and the rest is English. So more or less they have a collection of material in different languages. Probably the majority, let's say 70%, was in English, according to them. The 30% is French and 10% in Italian. I also highlighted the language policy on the slide, which they discovered while they were doing research with me, that there was a language policy, and they told me, oh, we didn't realize we could actually use Dutch as well. English, Italian, French, and Dutch are the official languages. And this is something that occurs quite often, that participants do not know about language policy and they realize only when the researcher comes into the field. Okay. So let's have a look at what they did with the material. So I showed them a bit of a selection of material that I selected according to what they told me was their interest. So they were interested, they needed English for meetings, they needed English for negotiation, they needed English meetings, have to write reports basically. So these were some examples of material. This was made them laugh quite a lot. This was examples of people body language, and they had to respond to the body language with either A or B. And they need to justify what they were doing, and they made them laugh, especially number 9, with that man trying to do something with this cravat. I don't know whether it's tying or loosening it. And if you choose A, would it make your life easier if we extended the credit period a little? Or B, of course, I don't want to pressure you at all. And that made them laugh quite a lot. They were saying things like, we don't have this kind of face-to-face negotiation. A lot of the negotiation happens behind closed doors. The negotiation, when you arrive to talking to the other people, actually, you have everything written out, or what they have to discuss, what you can propose. And a lot happens for conference calls, calls without video, for instance. So there's quite a lot to discover with your participants, and they have quite an interesting perspective on the materials. For just very briefly, for this one, you have to look at the introduction to a meeting, and these are some of the phraseology that are suggested by the book, this textbook, as interesting and important. You know, you would use to introduce to start the meeting. And they were commenting on things like, they were saying, oh yeah, this we may use, this we may not use. But they were commenting, quite frequent comments were about idiomatic expressions. That they would say, no, we're not familiar with this, I've never heard about it, I wouldn't use this. Like this one, to tie up any remaining loose ends. They were quite frequent comments. And one other example about small talk, and they were saying, well, we don't do small talks, we don't have time. Okay, so I ran this focus group with them about textbooks, and the group analyzed extracts of these, some of the materials I showed you, and in terms of relevance to them, relevance to future professionals, if they were used in the classroom, and occurrence of language in their experience. The comments on the global textbooks usually were that the textbooks were rather inappropriate for different reasons. The topics and the concepts were far too removed from the expert's experience. The language used was often rather constructed and not something they would use or have used in their experience. I didn't show you the example of the dialogue. They were referring especially to the dialogues of negotiations that they felt were really constructed. And they felt that the exercises didn't stimulate or include multilingual practices. What they liked quite a lot was the example of the dialogue from the textbook compared to any beginning of a dialogue from boys. And they really liked that. I didn't show this because it would be too long to show everything, but they noticed the real life communication as opposed to the constructed, and that's where their comment came from. Okay, they gave also some recommendations. So while we were talking, I was encouraging them to tell me, well, what would you do if you were the teacher? What can we do? And so they were saying, you know, include more translation as classroom activities. They were saying that they had to do a lot of translation between listening to a conference in English and then writing down the report in Italian, or carrying out the meeting in Italian and writing down the report in English. Switching from one to the other, so quite a lot of translation that was never included in their training. And they encourage students, also professionals, to build a collaborative glossary. They were saying we often come across these expressions, and when we have to write them down in another language, we don't know how, we don't know what they correspond to. So if we can all together put together our knowledge and put together a collaborative glossary, translation list of the most common. These were their recommendations. In terms of my recommendations for classroom activities and teacher training, and I'm about to finish. So in terms of classroom activities, I thought it was really interesting to get the learners to compare textbook dialogues with their own experience, or textbooks activities with their own experience. They were able to reflect, and they were quite advanced in their comments. Possibly also because they were already exposed to the ideas of variability or English as an international language in other interviews that I had done for the first phase of the project. So I'm actually aware of the fact that the research might have influenced their own criticality and increased their own criticality towards the textbook. Comparing the textbook dialogues to natural recurring dialogues was also very interesting to them. But certainly getting the learners to become ethnographers of their own professional communities is something that I would recommend. Getting the learners to exploit the resources they would use in their own context. Because these activities do add relevance to the learner's experience, but they also contribute to their engagement within a context and develop their criticality in relation to lingua-cultural input and to the dominance of a certain input in a global textbook. The students' engagement also is within their own perspective, so their approach and their criticality towards the dominant native speaker perspective in the textbook comes from their own perspective of business people that know what happens in their own life and are able to critically see that that's not represented in the textbook. So in an F-oriented, I will stop I will read this out. So I would say that in an F-oriented approach to teaching the materials are often quite removed from real life experiences, and teachers should be trained in material development, in evaluating, adapting and supplementing materials, which is usually not a big thing on teacher training. Teachers should discuss their role in relation to materials, maybe the role of the teacher more as a manager of learning, collaboration with the learners, which sees the role of the global textbook, in this case, would become less essential. So as said before, the left-oriented approach in this case becomes a more learner-centered approach to pedagogy, as Harry Wilson said this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alessia. Are there any questions? Everybody wants to get, yes, where are the drinks? Where's the reception taking place? Okay, thank you very much, everybody, for speaking on this colloquium. It was all very, very interesting. And thank you.